We begin this final hour of Fox and Friends Weekend with a Fox News alert. The Biden administration warning Kabul will likely see another terror attack before U.S. troops leave on Tuesday.
The warning comes as the U.S. launches a drone strike on the ISIS-K planner believed to be behind Thursday's bombing that killed 13 U.S. troops.
We go to Trey Yanks live in Doha, Qatar with the latest. Good morning, Trey.
Guys, good morning. Overnight, a U.S. drone strike took out an ISIS-K terrorist allegedly planning a further attack against U.S. forces on the ground in Kabul. According to a spokesman for U.S. Central Command on Friday, quote, the unarmed airstrike occurred in the Nangarhar province of Afghanistan. Initial indications are that we killed the target. We know of no civilian casualties. Now, this was in direct response to the suicide bombing that killed 13 U.S. service members and injured 18 others on Thursday. The State Department is still advising Americans to stay away from the gates of Kabul's airport as officials believe another attack is likely. The Taliban has tried to distance itself from the ISIS-K attack, an offshoot of the Islamic State that does have fighters in eastern Afghanistan. Asked about the organization on Friday, Pentagon Press Secretary John Kirby told Fox's Jennifer Griffin that thousands of ISIS-K militants were released from prisons when the Taliban took over. ISIS-K is considered an enemy of the Taliban, but given the current security situation in Kabul and across the country, even with good intelligence, it can be hard to stop a terror attack. With just 3 days left for American forces to leave Afghanistan before that self-imposed deadline, other U.S. allies like Germany and Italy have already pulled their forces out of Afghanistan, saying they are completing their evacuation operations. Back to you.
Thank you, Trey. Appreciate it. When you look at the next 24 to 48 hours, Trey, and the threat stream, are there any differences from what we heard before? I mean, obviously there was a threat issued by the State Department before our 13 U.S. troops were killed. Any indication? It's been a little bit more time here since the second threat, or the threat warning was given. Any indication on what they're planning for, looking at that airport right now?
Well, look, U.S. officials believe another attack on American forces on the ground in Kabul is likely. That's according to both the Pentagon and the State Department. But the major concern right now is trusting the Taliban. We saw new images from the ground in Kabul yesterday of Taliban security forces basically pushing out the perimeter from the airport. So you still have American troops, thousands of them there at the airport, relying on the Taliban to check anyone who would come into that security perimeter. And while there are still thousands of people being evacuated, the process to vet these people and actually pat them down to ensure that they don't have weapons or explosives on them before they board an aircraft is still the same. So the threat is there. American forces will be under a direct threat until they leave on Tuesday. And moving forward, really anything is expected. They are preparing for any possibility on the ground, but the contingency plans in place still do not take American troops out of harm's way.
Joining us now on the couch along with Trey Yanks is Joey Jones, former Marine bomb technician and Fox News contributor. So, Trey, and I'm sorry if I missed this in your report just here. So it sounds like what we're looking at is a likely possibility of another terror attack in conditions that remain largely the same. The gates are not yet reopened. We'll see if they do reopen. And the only real condition that we're relying on for a better circumstance would be the Taliban pushing out that security perimeter in a safer or further distance. I'm just trying to distinguish what makes this potential situation of a likely terror attack different from the conditions that led up to the last.
Good question.
Well, I think there's a lot of similar conditions on the ground. Again, the United States has to basically take the Taliban at their word that they are checking the security perimeter and doing everything they can to ensure that terrorists aren't getting through and close to American troops. But it's important to remember the Taliban is responsible for ISIS-K members and al-Qaeda members roaming free now in Kabul and across Afghanistan. When they worked their way through the country, large cities like Herat and Kandahar and even Bagram Air Base, where there was a prison housing thousands of these terrorists, the Taliban released them free into the country. And so the threat and the force that these militants and fighters now have on the ground has only increased since the Taliban took over. And the conditions in this last window, the retrograde period for the U.S. military, remain the same. And that is an extremely high threat level against U.S. forces and very, very few things to stop any potential terrorists from heading towards this soft target, this airport where there are thousands of civilians still trying to flee.
Trey, it's so important to note that it is the Taliban that released these prisoners, and these are the people that we're being asked to trust. You say the airport, the conditions are the same. I interviewed Representative Waltz yesterday, who said the other pathway is through the area that the resistance fighters have, and they've said we'll provide safe passage for Americans or anyone that, you know, needs safe harbor. Is that really a possibility?
Well, look, I think in the coming weeks you are going to see thousands of Afghans flee on foot. Once that critical air bridge closes, it's a major concern. The United Nations this week said we could see 500,000 Afghans flee to neighboring Pakistan on foot. And you already see the images along the border, people desperate to leave Taliban-controlled territory. But the reality on the ground is that it's extremely dangerous to do that. And when we're talking about Americans who are not only stuck in Kabul but across the country, this window is closing very quickly to get them to safety. And while you have these heroic actions by veterans, as you just heard on Fox and Friends, and by the American troops and special forces on the ground to conduct these individual missions to save Americans who are trapped, we have 3 days left. And it's going to be extremely difficult to conduct the final operations. And if they're not successful in getting every single American out of the country in that window, there's going to be a period where the Taliban controls the entirety of Afghanistan. U.S. forces are no longer on the ground, and there are really no safe ways out of Afghanistan for American citizens.
Trey, this attack was basically your conventional, unconventional IED, suicide bomb vest, gunfire after that. All we've talked about for a week now is how the Taliban is now in control of U.S. weapons. Is there anything to indicate that ISIS-K has that type of weaponry as well? Have they done anything as far as posturing troops at Kabul for like mortars or ground-to-ground missiles, things like that? Do you know if there's any kind of threat there that we really haven't talked about?
We don't know about the capabilities of ISIS-K right now and how many, if at all, American weapons the group has.
Yeah.
But it's extremely concerning when you look at the list of technology and weaponry that the Taliban was able to take control of. Basically, every single weapon, plane, and helicopter that was donated or sold to the Afghans over the past 20 years is now in the hands of the Taliban. And you saw these images outside of the airport just yesterday. American Humvees now controlled by the Taliban, and the only differentiation is that you see a white flag, the Taliban flag, on the back. A quick glance, you might think this is an American troop outside of the airport securing the area, but it's actually the Taliban. And that's just in Kabul. That's where there is some structure to the efforts by the Taliban. When you think about the more rural areas of Afghanistan, it's anyone's guess about where those weapons end up. And one just piece of information we have to remember, when some of those Afghan troops fled, when the Taliban took over, they actually drove American Humvees and weaponry into Iran. I mean, so there are not only ISIS affiliates on the ground in the region that could get control of American weapons, you also have foes like Iran that will now be able to look at and analyze American weaponry that has fallen into the hands of the Taliban and Afghan security forces who fled.
Trey Yingst, you paint a stark picture. We appreciate your time this morning. Thank you so much.
Yeah.